the next thing that that's in that section that Carla was going through is it shows up there at the very top. It says appraisal report, and again, that's the OGE appraisal report there. And down at the bottom where you see this big purple thing down there, it says B9. At the very bottom, you know, one of the things they talked about is how do you look at your employees and how do you make sure that they're accountable? Well, at the very part of our rating system, it's living OGE's values. It's kind of covered up by the purple thing, but that we were just trying to demonstrate that in that particular document. And then the next page is we have a values statement at OGE, but I want to refer you over to the next page, which at the bottom of it, it shows the number 6, like a page 6. At the very top, it says cultivating an ethical culture. And so that's one of the sections in the application. And what I wanted to mention there, which in that particular section, and anybody can do this, it says, the first question is, please provide a definition of ethical behavior as it relates to your organization. Now that wasn't hard for me at the time because like a lot of times you're going like, okay, let's go find this. Let's go get the code of ethics. Let's go try to find this. But I came to OGE in 2001 and I knew of OGE for many years before that, but when I got there and when we first started working on our first code of ethics, the one that kind of stunk, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that always I remembered is talking with Steve Moore, our CEO at the time, and Steve is no longer with us now, but he made this quote, and we put it in our first code of ethics, and we put it in every transmittal since then. It's, you know, about the goal was not only to comply with the law, but to avoid even the appearance of an impropriety. And so that always stuck with me, and so it's easy. You know, I mean, that was just a natural thing, and like at your organizations, there might be the CEO or someone else that's some guiding light out there that helps. And it's so you don't have to, not everything's a document. It's the tone at the top, and that, you know, he was at the top, so. But the tone at the top is a big deal, and, you know, like what do you see that in your organization that kind of drives home that tone at the top, excuse me, that can help in that area, so. Anyway, and again, that's just, these next 3 pages were our response to that section of the application. And as you notice, it's 3 pages. That's because the application tells you only 3 pages for this group, okay? You can't do real little font, like not itsy bitsy little font, just regular font. So I just thought I've focused on that about the last 2 days when I figured that out, because they had it in little print and I didn't read it. Kind of a weird deal, but and then we also, you see in there, we have a member agreement where we have every year our people sign off on the fact that they agree with the code of ethics and they don't know of any violations. Sometimes people actually will come forward and say, well, I need to come forward with something because I just, you know, there's something out there, so. Anyway, and then Carla had mentioned this. It's kind of an interesting thing here. We have a letter from our CEO. It's dated August 1, 2011. And we went out to our major suppliers and just saying, you know, like, we have a code of ethics, we want you to comply with it. What's interesting about that is that we found a great example of doing that. We hadn't done that before. We found a great example of that from Devon, actually. We used what Devon was doing, sending out things to their suppliers. And so again, it's the sharing that goes on between companies. I mean, we may compete in a lot of different ways, but we're not competing in being ethical. I think we all want, and that's the whole purpose of OK Ethics, is to just kind of help us all improve in the ethical arena.
Let's go back to the front section in front of the tabs to page 8. want to talk a little bit about forthright communication. What does that mean? And that, you know, we use the word transparency. Gosh, we hear that a lot these days, and everybody has their own definition of what that means. But, you know, our employees will call us on that, I think, and let us know if we're putting actions behind those words. And, you know, communications is something that's, it's not, you can talk a lot and not say necessarily meaningful things, but within organizations it's really, really important to have effective communications. And as it relates to ethics, what does that really mean, and how do you make it consistent and meaningful enough there? How do you accomplish transparency? And Gary has an example of that that I think is very helpful to think about it. There's a ton of ways you can do it, and you should do as many of those as you can, in my opinion, in terms of being open about your communications. This particular one has to do with you have an ethics process in place, you even have this hotline and people can report things, and then it's completely anonymous so that they feel safe, but then they don't know what happened. They don't know the results. Well, they can't necessarily always know all the details of the results. Sometimes those are employee issues, and you don't share all of the details of that. But then they fill that void of information and communication with, that just went to a big black hole, and nothing happened. And so Gary's going to talk a little bit about one way that OG&E got some of that kind of feedback and how they dealt with it.
Yes, one of the things we did as we were doing our ethics program, you know, we went through this a few years. We developed a good process for investigating any items that came forward. You know, I mean, we have 3,400 employees, and so there's always going to be something that pops up and that we'll look into. But one of the things initially is if you let attorneys help you with the program, which attorneys are very valuable people, don't get me wrong, but sometimes attorneys are cautious people, even more cautious than auditors, okay? And so then when you have an auditor and an attorney, that can be a bad combination. But anyway, oh yeah, it gets crazy. But anyway, so initially, I think that we did a pretty good job of, okay, we're going to look into we at OG&E look into each and every inquiry that comes in, and we report the result of each and every concern to our audit committee, which is a subcommittee of the board of directors. Each and everything that comes in. What we then did, so we were going through that process, and we would put out some communications about that, but we did a survey, the very first survey we did with this outside organization called the Corporate Executive Board. We got some feedback in the survey that said, you know, we asked them, do you have any concerns about reporting? Now, most people said, no, we don't have any concerns about reporting. This is not about the most people. This is about the people said, yes, we do have a concern about reporting. Again, it was probably 20% or a lower percent or a 10% said they do have a concern about reporting. And why is your concern about reporting? The small percent that said they have a concern, and they said, we don't believe that the company will take action. So there was some skeptical beliefs out there that we never thought was out there. We didn't know it was out there, but we would never have known it was out there unless we did this survey. And what we found is we had a benchmark to compare with the Corporate Executive Board, and the percentage that we had that belief that the company wouldn't take action was higher than the benchmark. So then what we started doing, as Carla said, is then we started saying, what are we doing wrong here? We need to start communicating to the broad organization that what we do and that actions are taken. We now even communicate that there were certain items substantiated, and there were so many terminations. You know, we will put over a period of time. We don't want to get real specific, because that's the issue. You don't want to like talk about one specific case because that's not fair. But over time, you want to you want to show the company, your people, that actions are being taken, particularly in a large organization with rumors. You know, once you get over, I don't know what the magic number is, but maybe 20 people, whatever, 3 people, rumors. There's rumor mills. And so, in essence, what we were trying to do is to give them real information, and at least, you know, that they maybe could know that actions are taken. And since that time, we're now more in line with what the benchmark is for the average company. We were out of line when we did the survey the first time, which was like 2007. So that's one thing I would say that gave us really valuable information and learning what to do there.
Thank you, Gary. And again, there's a lot of ways to communicate. As Gary said, he knew they were investigating every single one. They go to great pains, and Gary pulls together the right team, you know, whether it's an HR issue or, you know, where it lies, and looks into it very thoroughly. But employees didn't know that. Now, they don't need to know, as he said, all the nitty-gritty details, but they needed to know that there really were actions coming in. If you have a hotline or some other means of reporting, some say, well, we're going to get a lot of stuff that's not even really an ethics issue. And that's true. You get a lot, but you know what? That's okay. You want that line of communication open, and you deal with it. You don't jump because someone submits a concern and assume, number one, it's factual. You got to do your fact-finding investigation and then handle it appropriately. But you'd rather have that line of communication open so that employees can ask a question if they want to, and you can know, again, the more widespread you are, the more difficult it is sometimes to have enough information without having employees that are willing to share some of those concerns with you. But in terms of communication, Gary talked earlier and went through his example on a performance appraisal. Some companies have very formal processes, others have less formal. But if you know, an ethical culture, what are the behaviors that you expect? And that's going to be part of how you assess your employees. I mean, that's another means of communication. You know, you might think, well, I hadn't thought about that. That's not an internal memo. No, but it's communicating an expectation of what's expected, and have that consistency throughout your processes that somehow gives some reference and some point of context to the ethical culture that you want to continue to sustain. On that same page 8, the next section of the application is about corporate social responsibility. Again, that's another fairly wide category in terms of what all do we as going concerns, businesses in the state of Oklahoma or wherever we happen to be, what all should we be aware of and conscious about in terms of our social responsibility to the communities that we operate and live in, quite frankly. And again, I think there's no one right way to be involved and to show that corporate responsibility. I think a lot of organizations and most do something. So how do we demonstrate that? And what does that have to do with ethics? Gosh, I don't know. What does corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility, have to do with ethics? What do you think? Oh, I should have done this sooner. I love to call on people. What do you think? Yeah, corporate social responsibility. Why would we include that in an ethics assessment? And that's exactly right. You know, what does ethics mean? It's, you know, doing the right thing, right? And it's not just what's legal and illegal, because that's a different line. This goes much further than that. I've gotten a little sensitive and probably a little defensive about what I see as the environment, the climate, the noise in our country in the last few years that suggests, and maybe I'm being overly defensive, but suggests that if you're a for-profit company, that you don't care about social responsibility. You don't care about communities, you don't care about people, you know, it's all the bottom line. And I'm offended by that, because that's not been my experience, and that's not the world that I live in and the people that I work with and have had the opportunity to work with. That's just simply not the case. And I think the facts and personal experiences that we've all had probably suggest very differently than that. I regret that it's out there. I don't know why it's there, and I am concerned because I think some people that haven't had personal experiences with it believe that. And I think it's important that we show and demonstrate and be held accountable for things we are doing correctly in the area of corporate social responsibility. You know, it's everything from the environment to our communities and contributing to the things that are going on in our communities, you know, on the level of an individual and other things. So I think we have a lot of good examples, and I wouldn't want anybody to sell your organization short on that. I think it's great that it's in here, but it kind of closes that loop. And we put a few just examples that Devin had under tab 3, and we just had a document, frankly, that just kind of highlighted things. But you know, it covers a gamut of things. But from the category of safety and the environment, well, not only is it good business to care about the safety of your employees, but it is the right thing to do for every reason. And again, I think demonstrating that and making that clear to your employees, but also to the community that you live in. You know, the environment, that's, you know, there's a spectrum, I guess, of passion about that. But it's we were talking on the break about recycling, and I'm a confessed rabid recycler. I didn't grow up that way, you know, but I've become that way, and it's probably a little bit of credit to my OCD tendencies, but it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad habit, but you know, that's a silly little example. But every organization has certain areas of focus on environmental impact and what you're doing. Some get a lot more attention than others, but you know, doing just what you have to do to get by, to meet the legal requirements is one thing. Going beyond that and contributing to that in a more proactive way is something that I think is the right thing to do. And I think organizations do that, and it's good to acknowledge that that's part of the ethical culture that you have. But also just being involved in the communities, everything from volunteerism, small scale, large scale, charitable contributions, just things that make the community better for everybody. Are the kind of things that I think about in terms of the category of social responsibility. And that's what this one document, again, just kind of highlights a few of those. You know, some of us have a lot more opportunities brought to our door, but we all can do something. We all can find ways. And we can encourage our employees to do that and make it, you know, easy for them to do that and encourage them to do that. You know, you don't have to go to an extreme where it's going to get in the way of your productivity, but there are ways that you can make that a part of that culture in your organizations. And employees like that. They like to feel like they're contributing to something bigger than themselves.
And again, one of the latter sections there is on building trust in customer relations. And that, you know, like a lot of companies, may have certain guidelines to their customer serving people, employees about what to do, how to make sure that you do things with integrity and that type of thing. And I would also think, you know, and sometimes people will use customer, you know, awards for customer service here, but again, we're trying to tie into ethics. And one of the things I know that is, looking back at my background before OGE, that was with like the public accounting arena, sometimes the professional service organizations will go out and survey the customers about, you know, the nature of your customer service, but also were your people acting it with integrity, and things like that that could tie in here to demonstrate that, you know, serving your customers with integrity is a value of the organization. I think it's what we're looking for here. And so I guess
Yeah, and thank you, Gary. I'm going to talk a little bit about the example that we used, because everybody's, who do you think of as a customer? And you can define it pretty broadly sometimes, which is probably not a bad way to think about it. Sometimes we use the word stakeholder similarly. If it's other individuals that your organization interacts with that you want to be sure you're getting enough feedback. How are we demonstrating, how are we opening that avenue of communication to be sure that the culture that we want to portray is really out there? An example that Devin used is actually behind tab 1. It's the last 2 pages in tab 1, and it's a little bit different way maybe to think about a customer, but in the oil and gas business, we interact with a lot of landowners, and there's processes in place there, and you want to be sure that they have the opportunity to, if they've got a concern, a problem, something that they need to get resolved, that they've got an avenue to do that. And so you know, Devin has put, and probably many other companies do a very similar thing, but how do you put processes in place so that they can have their complaints resolved? And then how do you get feedback to know that it's actually working? You know, customer, well, you know, yeah, I think that we certainly would look at it that way. Our companies are dependent on those relationships with these landowners. But again, whether it's a customer that purchases a product or service from you, or just others that you interact with. Gary made a reference a little earlier to the vendor letters, you know, and that's another thing. You know, well, they're not our customers; we're their customers. Well, you know, labels don't necessarily matter. It's really more about having that expectation of an ethical approach and having them help hold you accountable to that. How do you keep that process open and that communication and that set of expectations clear to everybody involved? Again, in the areas that you are in, you'll have other ways to do that, and other individuals that you want to demonstrate that relationship and how important it is to your organization and your accountability for that.
But anyway, what they do is they go through and each judge, and they're assigned to different teams. So you have like a large company team that may have 3 judges on it, and another team that has 5. So, and maybe it just depends on how many applications we get. And, you know, we tend to, the large company category, we tend to put more judges on that, and our most experienced ones typically, because there's a lot more to digest on the large company side. But anyway, they will take a look at that. And you see there are 3 questions. Best practices. Can the processes be replicated by other companies? That's one thing they're looking for. And what we're trying to avoid there is it what Carla alluded to earlier. Are you systematically, is this a part of your culture? Sometimes we get applications, this is more typical of smaller businesses where it's all centered around the ethical compass, if you will, of the owner. And, you know, that's great, and they're doing some great things, but what if the owner was incapacitated? What would happen to the culture there, or if the owner retired? So they're looking for, gee whiz, how is this going to, you know, be maintained? Is it systemic? Okay, and that's one of the things. So be careful when you're doing your applications not to center it around a single individual or what have you. And can it be shared? Is this something that's unique just to them, or is it something that could be valued to other organizations in the state? Has the success been measured and documented? Of course, you know, we do a lot of things that are the right thing to do and they feel good, but how do you know it's really working unless you ask? So you have to be very intentional about that process. And finally, you remember I told you about the anecdotal piece? This is where it comes in. Has the organization, has it got the culture of heart that rewards integrity at work? And so you have your documented, measurable processes, but you also have, like I referred to, the copper mark letter, and some of you may have seen that in their application. You know, are they really demonstrating a heart for this? But anyway, they break it down into scores. And each judge takes these and they independently analyze each application. And if you can imagine, you saw some of the size of these. That's a lot of reading. And they will score it. Usually they read over these twice, once to get the flavor, and then the next time to go back and evaluate them. So they independently rate it. And then we meet. Actually, after it's like 2 or 3 weeks, I don't think we've set the date, but we give them a couple of weeks to review it and digest it. And then we meet and they discuss what they saw that, they thought was really, really strong, and then they rate the company's initiatives. So it's a really involved process. I don't think people realize how much work the judges do. And they're very committed, very sincere. Does that help? Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay, we're careful not to put a judge on a team where they would be reviewing an application of a competitor. So we're very careful. We actually ask each judge to sign a conflict of interest. Likewise, if their wife works for the company, we prefer that they not judge that company. So we're very, very careful about that too. So they're very conscientious. Group of people. We're very fortunate. And in your Compass Award application, or in your Compass Award booklets, it shows about the Compass Awards, how it's evaluated, and then I am so happy. Most of these judges are coming back this year, so we've got some really good experienced people. And they're awesome. And, Gary's going to be our new one, so on the team. So anyway, do look this over. And in the booklet, you will also find just little excerpts of best practices from, which I can't find right now, but I'm sure I saw it in here. So yeah, here it is, from previous award winners. So just little hints, tidbits. You couldn't put the whole application, but things that the group was impressed with when reviewing the applications. So I think you'll find those very helpful to you. So, okay. Let you get the back. I'm glad you brought that.
Yes. Thank you, Shannon. Again, we've talked at the beginning of the program about the benefits of applying, and I wanted to return to that a little bit because I shared with you my reaction at first was, well, why hasn't Devina won this award, right? It was that competitive thing coming out, and it's about winning. But I learned through the process of doing it and then being involved with the judging process and reading a lot of applications and talking with people, there's a far greater value than that, in my opinion. If I were going to do a startup company, which I'm not at this point in my life, but if I were, I've thought about that and wanted to know how do you, and when we were first putting ethics programs together, it's like, well, what does that mean? What does that look like? We didn't really have any models for that, and I think that's another really important value that this process, this award application structure has provided for people is, what would you do? And use it for a tool for that purpose. So depending on where you're at, if you're a startup, if you're a company that's been around for a little while, you've put some things into place, but you want to make it better, and you want to make it more sustainable, as Shannon talked about. Here, where do I start? Well, let's look at this and see, what do I already have that's working well, and what are some of the components that I don't have that I might want to put into place to just make it stronger. So I really do think it's worthwhile for that purpose. Again, you've had, Shannon, I know Copper Mark Bank has won the award twice. Are they the only company? Yes. Okay. So, they came back and saw some value. You know what, we've done some things, but we think there's some other areas that we'd like to continue to improve on. We've heard some other best practices that we would like to put into place. So I think it's something that's an ongoing value and benefit to assess and see how you're doing. Our cultures are sustainable only if we nurture them and keep them vital. And as time goes by, again, I've said, the older I get, the more history I have, and the more I learn from that history about, as people come and go in your organization changes. It just does. Everybody contributes something, and as new people come in, you know, they contribute to it too. So having something that is consistent, especially in something in the area of ethics that is most important to our culture, having processes and systems in place that help sustain that as the organization evolves over time is really, really important. I am not aware of any best practice on that. Are you, Gary?
I'm really not either. At our company, you know, like I've said, we're a bigger company. But what we've done with the ethics program is we've run this out of our, I'm internal audit vice president, and so we tried to leverage that. And when I look at incremental cost, you know, there's not a lot of incremental cost. But for us, there is some. Having an ethics hotline, for example, is an incremental cost. But that's one of the most, for a large company, that's really cost effective because you have somebody 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you pay less than $10,000 for that to be part of that ethics hotline because you use an outside party. By using an outside party, it's better because then the people are going to go, well, it's an outside party, it's not somebody in the company, you know. Yeah, they're not going to recognize whatever. So that's part, and we actually have done a little bit more incrementally because working with that corporate executive board is some added costs because we're a member of that. But I don't know that we added additional people for our ethics program. We're big enough that we have an internal audit department. A lot of companies don't have internal audit departments. A lot of times that's public companies that do, and not private companies typically do not have an internal audit department. So I guess.
Yeah, and in public companies, we're actually required to do a few of these things, not everything that we do. But to Gary's point, we use resources that we already have in place, like the Human Resources Department, or if we happen to have security at both of our companies, sometimes they get involved. Right. You know, it might be the accounting department has to look into an issue and that type of thing. But even, you know, if you can't go in and hire this ethics hotline, you know, for $10,000, can you just set up a phone line that's anonymous that people can call into, or some other way to set up a process that's not so costly?
I'm going to give an example here. That's a great point that Carla just made. We do the ethics hotline now, and part of the reason we do that is because it's a requirement under law for public companies. But before we had the ethics hotline, we had this other thing that was done internally. It was called, at our company, it's called the Listen Line. And it's like a suggestion box. So let's say your company, you know, what we do at OGE is I go look at what comes in on the Listen Line to see if there's anything of an ethical nature that we look into. So maybe you have a practice, maybe there's some feedback you get, and you make sure that you look at those things for ethics issues and then look into them. You know, that's another way to do it that wouldn't cost anything.
I know, like, we're pricing like employee surveys, and that was eye-opening to me to use a third-party group.
Yes.
Right.
And then I love your flyer. Your brochure is beautiful. You know, and I can imagine that's.
Tell the story how you got that work done really low cost.
Oh, we did get it done kind of low cost.
Utilities are ultra conservative.
We're very conservative. But we got it done because again, the first time we did our booklet, the boring booklet, I'm just being honest, the one we did in the early 2000s is we did that mostly internally, and then we put it outside to be printed. But on that one, we actually used some graphics artist company, but it was a startup company. And so, you know, they really did it at a lower cost because they wanted to develop a relationship with us, and actually they still do some work with us, and they did a great job, you know. But the second time we kind of, as Shannon was talking about, we tried to capture the culture, you know, make it, this is the culture, this is our people. We actually even looked in there to make sure that none of the pictures in there was anybody that was in any type of trouble too, so, yeah.
Well, and the other thing about it was to make it readable and interesting to people to read. the original code of conduct, and like many of our companies have, it looked like a policy statement. There's nothing more boring looking than a policy statement, and sometimes they're just not the easiest to read and get a lot out of. So putting it into a format, and didn't lose any of the content of the real meat, if you will, of the code. It was still there, which was the general counsel's concern, which we reassured him. But it made it easier to read when you got the little bubbles in the pictures and you get through it, and it makes people, you know, I think, a little more interested to know what that code does say.